She walked in wearing a red dress and a smile she'd practiced in the mirror for 40 minutes, and within 30 seconds, the entire restaurant had already decided what kind of evening this was going to be. Not for her. For them. The whispers moved table to table like smoke, low, fast, and impossible to outrun. Brielle Hawthorne, 39 years old, worth more than every person in that room combined, stood at the host's podium while a woman in pearls leaned toward her husband and said something that made him cover his mouth with his napkin. Brielle heard it anyway. She always did. If you've ever walked into a room and felt invisible and exposed at the exact same time, stay with me. Like this video and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The reservation was under Hawthorne, party of two, and the maitre d', a thin man named Gerald with the posture of someone who'd spent 20 years being professionally pleasant, found it in the book after an awkward 3-second pause that Brielle absolutely clocked but chose not to address. She had learned, somewhere around her mid-20s, that calling out every small humiliation was exhausting and ultimately pointless. People rarely changed in real time. They just got defensive and ruined the rest of your evening. "Right this way, Ms. Hawthorne," Gerald said, and he was professional enough that his voice didn't waver, which she appreciated. The restaurant was called Ardent. It had been open 14 months and already had a 2-month waiting list. The interior was all dark wood and warm amber lighting, the kind of place where the candles were real beeswax and the menus had no prices because if you needed to ask, you'd made a wrong turn somewhere. Brielle had eaten here once before, alone, on a Tuesday evening when the place was half empty. She'd liked the duck confit and the quiet corner table near the window that looked out onto Michigan Avenue in the rain. Tonight was Friday. The place was full. She followed Gerald through the main dining room and she felt the room shift the way rooms always shifted when she walked through them. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in pieces. A woman at a foretop glanced up from her risotto. A man in a gray suit paused mid-sentence. 2 women near the bar, both in their 30s, both in black dresses that probably cost more than Nolan Pierce's monthly rent, looked at each other with the particular kind of smile that doesn't require words. Brielle was a plus-size woman in a world that had opinions about that. She was also the founder and CEO of Stellar Path Technologies, a Chicago-based AI infrastructure company she'd started in her living room at 23 with $40,000 in student loan money she probably should have used for something else. The company was now worth $460 million. She had been on the cover of Fast Company twice and Wired once. Her most recent product launch had been covered by 17 major publications and 3 national news broadcasts. None of that was visible when she walked into a room. What people saw was a body type they'd been trained by decades of magazine covers and romantic comedies and offhand comments to register as a problem. She had long since stopped being shocked by it. She had not, however, stopped feeling it. Gerald seated her at a table for 2 near the center of the room, not the corner she'd had last time, not tucked away where the lighting was gentler and the ambient noise provided a little cover. Center of the room, visible from every angle. She wondered briefly whether this had been a deliberate choice or just an available table, then told herself it didn't matter and sat down. She ordered sparkling water and opened the menu even though she'd already decided on the duck. The rain had started up again outside. Through the window, she could see the wet gleam of Michigan Avenue, the blurred headlights of passing cars, people on the sidewalk tilting umbrellas against the wind. There was something about rainy Fridays in Chicago that she'd always liked, the way the city pulled inward, the way the lights reflected off wet pavement and made everything look like it was happening inside a painting. She checked her phone. The message from Richard Colt, her board chairman, read, "His name is Marcus Hale, Regional VP at Dominion Capital. Good looking, smart, my wife says charming. He's been briefed. You'll like him. Stop overthinking it." She had in fact been overthinking it since Tuesday. Not because she was nervous about meeting someone new. She'd sat across from senators and venture capitalists and once a former head of state, and she hadn't been nervous for any of those. But because blind dates arranged by board chairmen carried a particular flavor of pressure that she found difficult to metabolize. Richard meant well. Richard always meant well. He was 64 years old and had been happily married for 37 years to a woman named Donna, who made excellent lemon bars and genuinely believed that Brielle just needed to meet the right person and everything would fall into place, as though her life were a piece of furniture that just needed assembling. Brielle loved Richard. She found his optimism both touching and deeply exhausting. She set her phone face down on the table. At the table to her left, 4 people were having what appeared to be a work dinner, papers spread out alongside their appetizers, someone's laptop open at the edge of the table in defiance of the restaurant's aesthetic. At the table to her right, slightly behind her, and at an angle she'd have to turn deliberately to see, a man sat with a young girl. The girl was maybe 8 years old, with dark braids and a gap in her front teeth visible when she spoke, which was often. The man was... Brielle caught just a peripheral impression of him before she returned her attention to the menu. Younger than she'd expected someone dining at Ardent on a Friday to be, and he looked slightly out of place in a way she couldn't immediately define. She ordered the duck when the server came. She was halfway through a piece of bread when Marcus Hale arrived. She knew it was him because he came in scanning the room with the particular energy of someone who expected to be pleased by what they found, and because Richard had texted her a photo. He was tall, conventionally handsome in a carefully assembled way. The suit was good. The hair was recently cut. The jaw was the kind that photographed well. He was smiling at the maitre d' with the comfortable ease of someone who was used to being welcomed. He looked exactly like the kind of man Donna Colt would describe as charming. Brielle watched him scan the room. She watched him find her. She watched his face do the thing. It wasn't dramatic. It never was, in her experience. People rarely made a scene in the first moment. The first moment was just a recalibration, an almost involuntary adjustment of expression, a slight flattening of the smile, a fraction of a second where the eyes processed the information and ran it against whatever expectation had been in place. Marcus Hale's fraction of a second lasted maybe 3/4 of a second, which was longer than average. Then he crossed the room. She was already sitting up slightly straighter, not because she was nervous, but because she'd learned that posture was armor, and she buckled it out of habit. "Brielle?" he said, stopping at the table. He didn't sit down. "That's me," she said. "Marcus?" "Yeah." He looked at her for a moment, just looked. Then he looked around the restaurant, a quick, casual survey that wasn't casual at all, and then he looked back at her with the particular expression of a man making a decision. "Richard said you were... He described you differently." She kept her voice level. "How did he describe me?" "He said..." Marcus stopped. He laughed once, brief and humorless. "You know what? This isn't..." He lowered his voice, but not enough. The table of 4 with the laptop were close. The man with the young girl was close. "You're not really what I was expecting, and I don't think this is going to work." "You've been here for 45 seconds, Brielle said. "I know, I'm just..." He shook his head. He was still standing. He'd never sat down. That detail would stay with her longer than anything else, somehow, that he hadn't even sat down. "I'm going to be honest with you because I think that's kinder than wasting both our time. I'm very specific about, I have a type physically, and you don't..." He glanced around again as if checking whether this was being observed. It was. "You're clearly very successful, and I'm sure you're a great person, but physically, I'm not..." "You're not attracted to me," Brielle said flatly. "I just don't think it's fair to either of us to..." "You can say it out loud, Marcus. You're not attracted to fat women." Her voice was quiet and completely even. She had no idea how it was so even. Inside, something had closed up like a fist. "It's a sentence. It won't kill you." Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, and then did something she hadn't expected. He laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a self-conscious laugh. A genuine, slightly incredulous laugh, the kind that said he found her response presumptuous. "You know what? Yeah, sure. I'm not. And I'm allowed to have preferences." He said it a little louder now, the way people get louder when they want an audience to validate them. "I'm not going to apologize for knowing what I want. Most guys would have strung you along all night to be polite. I'm doing you a favor." The table of 4 had gone silent. She was aware, in a peripheral and terrible way, that other tables had gone quiet too. The particular restaurant silence that happens when something is going wrong in public and everyone is pretending they can't hear it while hearing every word. "You're a billboard," Marcus said, and he was really going now. the momentum of his own righteousness carrying him forward.
You know that? You walk in here and you take up the whole... He made a gesture with his hand that encompassed her presence, her body, the space she occupied. I'm not going to sit here and pretend I don't notice. Brielle said nothing. She was afraid that if she opened her mouth, something would come out that couldn't be taken back. She was afraid, more specifically, that she would cry. And she absolutely would not cry in the middle of Ardent on a Friday night in front of 50 people and Marcus Hale, who was not worth a single tear from anyone, let alone her. So she said nothing, and she looked at the bread basket, and she waited for him to finish. Good luck, Marcus said, with a kind of practiced finality, and he turned around and walked back toward the exit with the unhurried step of a man who believed he'd handled that well. The restaurant noise came back in pieces. Cutlery, ice in a glass. Somewhere near the bar, a soft burst of laughter that had nothing to do with her but felt pointed anyway. The foretop beside her returned to their papers. A server passed with a tray. Brielle picked up her water glass. Her hand was not shaking. She noted this with something like distant, professional approval, the way she would note a successful code deployment. "Excuse me." The voice came from her right, male even, and carrying the particular quality of someone who'd chosen his words carefully before speaking them. She turned. The man from the table to her right was standing. He wasn't looking at her yet. He was looking in the direction Marcus Hale had gone, though Marcus was already through the door and gone. The man was maybe 6 feet tall, dark-haired, with the build of someone who did physical work for a living. Not a gym build, not the sculptural result of a personal trainer and a meal plan, but the practical, unself-conscious strength of someone who lifted and carried and moved through the world with his body as a tool. He was wearing a dark gray button-down that was clean and pressed but not expensive, and he had the kind of face that was interesting rather than handsome, not symmetrical enough to be a face that launched anything, but the kind of face you kept looking at because something in it was honest. He was maybe 32. There were traces of exhaustion under his eyes that had settled in so permanently they'd become part of his face. He turned toward the door and raised his voice to a register that carried without being a shout. "Hey!" He wasn't talking to Brielle, but Marcus Hale had already left. The man stood there for a moment, and then he did something she hadn't expected. He sat back down, across from the small girl with the braids, who was watching all of this with the frank, unfiltered attention of a child who hadn't yet learned that staring was impolite. Brielle turned back to her table. There was a pause of maybe 30 seconds, which felt much longer. Then the man said quietly and directly to her, "Would you like to join us for dinner?" She turned to look at him again. He met her eyes without the slight flicker of discomfort that people usually had. No recalibration, no adjustment. He just looked at her the way you'd look at someone you were talking to. "I'm Nolan," he said. "This is Avery." He nodded at the girl, who waved with both hands, then seemed to realize that was too much and reduced it to one hand. "We just ordered, and the bread here is genuinely good, and you don't have to sit by yourself if you don't want to." He said it with no ceremony, no performance. He didn't look around to see if anyone was watching him do a good thing. Brielle looked at the table. She looked at the girl, who had now returned to examining the dessert menu with the intensity of a researcher approaching a primary source. She looked at the man, Nolan, who had returned to his water glass and was giving her the space to answer without hovering over it. "The duck is supposed to be excellent," Brielle said after a moment. "That's what I've heard," Nolan said. She picked up her water glass and her bread and moved to their table. His daughter's name was Avery Grace Pierce, and she was 8 years old and had strong opinions about several things, which she communicated with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned that adults preferred children to be more strategic about their honesty. "You have really good earrings," Avery told Brielle within the first 4 minutes. "Are those real?" "Avery?" Nolan said. "What? They're really shiny." "You don't ask people if their jewelry is real." "Why not?" "Because..." He looked briefly at the ceiling. That's just not a question we ask." "They are, though," Brielle said. "White sapphire. The real ones were my mother's, but I lost one of the earrings at a conference in Seattle 4 years ago, and I've never fully recovered from it." Avery nodded with the gravity this deserved. "My mom had a necklace," she said. "It's in a box in Dad's closet. He says it's for when I'm older, The table shifted slightly.
Not uncomfortably, just the way tables shift when something real has entered the room. That's a good thing to have, Brielle said. Yeah. Avery returned to the dessert menu. Do you think he'll let me get the chocolate thing? The lava cake? Brielle looked at Nolan. She already knows the answer, Nolan said. She asks every time we go somewhere nice, and every time I say, he says maybe, Avery said, which means no, but he feels bad about it. Nolan looked at his daughter with an expression that was somewhere between exasperated and completely helpless. It was the expression of a man who'd been outflanked so many times he'd stopped being surprised by it. The lava cake, Brielle told the server when he came back. For the table, please. Avery looked at her with an expression of absolute, uncomplicated joy. Nolan said, You don't have to. I know, Brielle said. He looked at her for a moment, then he looked back at the table. They ordered. The food came. The rain continued outside, and the restaurant moved around them in the way restaurants do. The ambient noise of other people's lives, the back and forth of servers, the soft percussion of silverware and glasses. Avery ate with the focused efficiency of a child who'd been told to have good table manners and was succeeding through visible effort. Nolan ate the way people eat when they're tired, steadily, without a lot of commentary, but present. What do you do? Brielle asked him. Right now? HVAC tech during the day. 3 evenings a week I do security work at a place on the north side. He said it straightforwardly, the way you say something true. Not apologetically, not with the slight preemptive defensiveness she sometimes heard from people who expected her to be impressed by things or disappointed by things. Just, here's information, take it or leave it. Long days, she said. They are what they are. He picked up his water. You? Tech company, AI infrastructure. He nodded like this was normal, which she appreciated because sometimes when she said it, people treated it like a trap. What does that mean, AI infrastructure? Avery asked. She'd been listening with one ear while appearing to be entirely focused on the bread. It means I build the systems that other companies use to run their AI, Brielle said. Like, she thought for a moment. You know how your school probably has a computer lab? Yeah. And the computers all connect to each other and to the internet? Yeah. Someone has to build and maintain the system that makes all of those connections work. I do that, but for really large companies, and for AI systems specifically. Avery considered this. So you're like the janitor of the internet? Nolan made a sound that was very close to a laugh. In a way, Brielle said, in a very well-compensated way, but yeah, basically. That's cool, Avery said with absolute sincerity. They talked. That was the thing Brielle would remember afterward. They actually talked, in the way people do when nobody is performing. Avery asked approximately 14 questions between the entree and the lava cake, which arrived in a state of perfect volcanic achievement and caused her to close her eyes briefly in something that might have been reverence. Nolan talked about a job he was working on out in Evanston where the HVAC system was older than he was and had been repaired so many times by so many different technicians that it had developed, in his words, a personality. Brielle talked about the first time she'd pitched investors, which had been in a room of 12 men in their 50s, 11 of whom had spent the first 20 minutes looking at their phones, and one of whom had fallen asleep. Asleep, Avery said. Head back, mouth open, full asleep, right in the middle of my revenue projection slide. What did you do? I kept going, Brielle said. What else are you going to do? Avery looked at her with an expression of pure admiration. I kept going, Brielle said again, quieter, more to herself than to either of them. I've always kept going. Nolan was watching her, not with the particular scrutiny of someone cataloging her, not with the evaluating look she sometimes got from people in business settings who were trying to figure out whether she was useful to them. Just watching, the way you watch someone when you're actually listening to what they're saying. For what it's worth, he said, what that guy did tonight. He paused. He'd been careful all evening not to bring it up, and she had the distinct sense that he'd been deciding whether to say this or leave it alone, and had landed somewhere in between. He doesn't get to define the tone of your evening, You got to sit here and eat good food, and my daughter informed you that you're the janitor of the internet, which I think we can all agree is a significant milestone. Avery pointed her fork at him in agreement. Brielle laughed. It surprised her. The specific quality of it, the fact that it was real. No, she said. I suppose he doesn't. Tchem. The check came. Nolan reached for it. Brielle put her card down first. He started to object, and she said, "The lava cake was my idea," in a tone that closed the conversation. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between acknowledgement and something more complicated. Then he said, "Okay, thank you." Avery had fallen asleep somewhere between the dessert and the check, her head tipped sideways against the booth cushion, one braid fallen across her face. Nolan looked at her with the particular expression parents get when their children are asleep in public, helpless and fond and terrified of waking them. "She does this," he said, "goes from 100 miles an hour to completely out, no in between." "She's extraordinary," Brielle said. She meant it. Yeah. He said it simply, like it was something he knew well and had never needed anyone else to confirm, but was glad to hear confirmed anyway. They waited for the car Brielle had called. She'd insisted on having her driver take them home, which had produced a brief negotiation she'd won by pointing out it was raining and they had no umbrella. Nolan had carried Avery through the restaurant with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it hundreds of times, the girl's head against his shoulder, her braids splayed across his chest. At the door, before the car came, he said, "I'm sorry about what happened tonight. The way that guy—" "Don't be sorry," Brielle said. "You didn't do it." "No, I should have said something to him before he left. I stood up and then he was gone and I—" "You invited me to your table," she said. "That was more than anyone else did." He looked at her with those eyes that didn't flinch. "Anyone else would have done the same thing," he said. She wanted to tell him that wasn't true, that she'd been in rooms her whole adult life where people watched things happen to her and found reasons not to intervene, not because they were cruel necessarily, but because intervening was uncomfortable and not intervening was easy, and people generally chose easy. She didn't say that. She said, "Have a good night, Nolan." "You too, Brielle." He said her name like it was just a name, not a brand, not a headline, not the opening line of a Forbes entry or a cautionary tale or a punchline. The car pulled up. She got in. Through the rain-streaked window, she watched Nolan stand at the entrance of Ardent with his sleeping daughter pressed against his shoulder, waiting for the walk signal. He didn't look back at the restaurant. He didn't look back at her car. He stood in the rain with his daughter, and he waited for the light to change, and when it did, he walked. Brielle looked at her hands in her lap. She was a woman who had built a $460 million company from a living room and a loan she probably should have used for something else. She had survived pitch meetings and hostile acquisitions and a public profile that invited commentary the way open water invited weather. She had a corner office on the 38th floor of a building with her company's name on the lobby directory. She had survived more than she ever talked about in interviews and more than she'd ever told anyone, including Richard Colt, including her own mother, who was 71 years old and lived in Naperville and called every Sunday and never quite said the things that would have helped, but always called. She had not in a very long time sat in a restaurant and talked to someone who looked at her like she was just a person at a table. The car moved through the rain. She thought about the girl's hands on the dessert menu. She thought about a man's tired eyes, and the way he'd said "you don't have to" when she ordered the lava cake, not as a criticism, but as a genuine recognition that she was doing something she hadn't been asked to do. She thought about Avery's voice, unfiltered and certain. "You're like the janitor of the internet." She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth and looked out at the rain on the glass. She wasn't sure what she was feeling exactly. She was a woman who was good at knowing what she was feeling and then deciding how much of that information was actionable. This did not feel immediately actionable. It felt, more than anything, like something that had been very nearly ruined and had somehow, improbably, not been. The city moved past the window in the rain, streetlights and storefronts, and the long, wet corridor of Michigan Avenue, and Brielle Hawthorne sat very still in the back of a car and did not cry, which she'd promised herself she wouldn't, and did not feel sorry for herself, which she'd promised herself she wouldn't, and thought instead about the particular quality of a laugh that surprises you and what it means when the room you're in suddenly, for no reason you can easily explain, starts to feel a little more like somewhere you're allowed to be.
She didn't look him up until the following Wednesday. That was 4 days. She was proud of the 4 days because the urge to look had been there on Saturday morning when she woke up and lay in her apartment with the rain still going outside, and the city still gray, and the memory of the evening at Ardent still sitting in her chest like something she hadn't finished processing. The urge had been there Sunday when she was on the phone with her mother, who asked how the date went and received the answer fine, and knew it wasn't fine but also knew better than to push. The urge had been there Monday during a 2-hour strategy meeting where Trevor Voss, her CFO, had spent 40 minutes on a slide deck about Q3 projections while Brielle sat at the head of the table and thought, twice, about the way Nolan Pierce had said you don't have to when she'd ordered the lava cake. Wednesday. She looked him up Wednesday. It wasn't hard. He was real enough to find, but not prominent enough to have much of a digital footprint. A LinkedIn profile that hadn't been updated in 3 years. An old Yelp review he'd left for an auto parts store in Wicker Park. A mention in a community newsletter from 18 months ago about a neighborhood HVAC drive for low-income seniors that he'd apparently organized or helped organize. The article was short and vague. There was no Facebook, no Instagram, no presence that suggested a man who performed his life for an audience. She found out his last name was Pierce. She found out he'd worked for the same HVAC company, Meridian Climate Solutions, for 6 years. She found out, through a detail in the newsletter, that he'd grown up in the Bridgeport neighborhood on the south side. That was it. That was the whole digital record of Nolan Pierce, as far as she could find, and for reasons she did not examine too closely, she found this oddly reassuring. She closed the tabs. She told herself she was simply curious. She told herself the evening had been unusual, and unusual evenings produced unusual levels of residual thought, and that was perfectly normal and did not require further action. She opened a new tab and looked up the address of Meridian Climate Solutions. She didn't go there. She was clear with herself about that. She was not going to show up at the man's workplace like someone who'd lost perspective. Instead, she went to the neighborhood. Not Bridgeport, where he'd grown up, but the area near the north side address mentioned in a work order reference she'd found through slightly more determined searching than she was comfortable admitting to. A Tuesday evening, 3 weeks after Ardent, she'd told Marcus, her head of security, that she was taking a walk and wanted to go without the car, which produced a conversation she won through sheer executive authority. The neighborhood was called Avondale, technically, though the blocks she walked through had the quality of a place that was between things, not the kind of neighborhood that showed up in lifestyle articles about Chicago's most exciting emerging districts, but not a place that had given up on itself either. There were 3 nail salons and a laundromat with a hand-lettered sign in the window, a Dominican restaurant with good smells coming out of it, a corner store where a teenage boy sat on the front step with his phone, buildings that were old but not derelict, the kind of buildings that had been maintained by people who didn't have money for anything more than maintenance, and so had put their care into the basics. Clean windows, shoveled walks, a potted plant here and there on a stoop. She hadn't planned to see him. That was what she told herself. And then she did see him. He was coming out of a building 2 blocks down, a 3-flat with a blue door, in his work clothes, carrying a toolbox, and he was on the phone. He was walking in her direction. She had approximately 12 seconds to make a decision, and she made the one that seemed least insane, which was to keep walking and let chance determine what happened next. He looked up when they were about 30 feet apart. She watched him process her presence, the slight recalibration, the recognition, and then something that was neither wariness nor performance, but a kind of genuine, unguarded surprise. "Hey," he said. He lowered his phone. "Hey," she said. There was a pause. "You live around here?" he asked. "No." She decided honesty was the least complicated option. I had a meeting in Roscoe Village, and I'm walking back toward the train." This was not entirely true. The meeting had been in River North, which was not close, and she was not going to take the train. But it was not entirely false either, because she'd had a meeting in Roscoe Village that morning, so the geography existed in some plausible way.
He looked at her for a moment like he was deciding how much to believe that, and she had the uncomfortable feeling that he was perceptive in ways she should have anticipated. "You want to walk?" he said. They walked. He had finished for the day. The job had been a boiler inspection in a building that turned out to have 3 separate issues, one of which was going to require parts he'd have to order, which meant going back Thursday, which meant rearranging his Thursday schedule, which was already tight because he had Avery's parent-teacher conference at 4. He said all of this not as a complaint, but in the manner of someone narrating the logistics of a life that required constant navigation. "How is Avery?" Brielle asked. Something in his face changed, not dramatically, but perceptibly, the way a window changes when the light hits it differently. "She's good. She's doing a project at school about inventors, and she's decided she wants to interview you." Brielle stopped walking. "She's 8, Nolan said quickly. "She doesn't know your schedule. He looked slightly pained. "She announced it at breakfast last week like it was already arranged. I told her she couldn't just interview someone without asking, and she said, 'You know her, so ask her.' And I said that wasn't how it worked, and she said..." He stopped. "What did she say?" "She said, 'Dad, you never ask for help, and look how tired you are.'" He delivered this with the flat effect of a man who'd been comprehensively dismantled by an 8-year-old. Brielle started walking again. She was quiet for a moment. "Tell her yes," she said. "Brielle, I mean it. Tell her I'll set aside 30 minutes. She can ask me whatever she wants." He looked at her sideways. "You run a $400 million company." "460, she said. "And yes." "That's a lot of money." "It is." "Then your time costs more than..." "Nolan." She stopped again and turned to look at him directly. "I want to do it. Avery is remarkable. She told me I was the janitor of the internet, and it's been the most honest professional assessment I've received in 3 years. Please let me do it." He was quiet. Then he said, "Okay." They kept walking. She found out, over those 23 blocks, more about the life of Nolan Pierce than a week of careful searching had turned up. He'd married young, 24, a woman named Kara, who'd grown up 3 blocks from him in Bridgeport, who'd been a pediatric nurse, who'd been diagnosed with a heart condition when Avery was 2 and died 17 months later. He'd been 28. He told this not in the way people sometimes told hard stories, with the practiced cadence of someone who'd found a way to make it bearable to hear, but haltingly, with the uneven rhythm of someone who still had to navigate around certain words. She did not say she was sorry in the reflexive way people said it. She said, "Avery must have been so little." 3.5, he said. "She remembers some things." Not her voice. "She says she remembers something about a smell, like lavender, but she's not sure if it's a real memory or something she made up from a picture." He was quiet. "I don't correct her either way." Brielle thought about a necklace in a box in a closet. She thought about a father who kept it safe for a daughter who wasn't ready for it yet. "That's the right call," she said. He looked at her. "Is it?" "I think so." He nodded once, like he was filing this away. By the time they reached the corner where they'd have to part ways, her car was 3 blocks east, though she hadn't mentioned the car. She knew that he'd taught himself HVAC from scratch after Kara died because the job he'd had before, warehouse logistics, didn't have schedule flexibility, and he needed to be available for Avery. She knew that he hated the security job, but that it paid for Avery's after-school program, which was the only real enrichment he could afford, and that Avery had recently decided she wanted to learn the violin, which Nolan had looked up and discovered was not cheap. She knew that he cooked exactly 4 meals reliably: pasta, a chicken stir-fry, breakfast tacos, and a soup that had been Kara's recipe that he'd never fully gotten right, but kept making. She knew that he read to Avery every night still, even though she was 8 and could read herself, because it was the thing they did and the thing was important, and the thing had been important since before Kara died, and he was keeping it going because some things you just kept going. He was not a man who talked about himself easily. She got all of this in fragments, the way you get things from people who are used to being the person who asks the questions instead of answering them. "I should let you..." he started. "The interview," she said. "Tell Avery I'm serious. Have her write her questions down first. It'll be better if she prepares." He looked at her. "You're going to regret saying that. She'll take it very seriously."
Good. He almost smiled. It was close. Good night, Brielle. Good night. She walked 3 blocks east and got into her car, and sat in the back seat and looked at the city going past, and thought about a man who learned a whole new trade from scratch, so he could be available for his kid, and cooked a soup that wasn't quite right, and kept the necklace in a box, and read aloud every night to a daughter who could read herself. She thought about how many people she knew with more money and more comfort who were doing less. Trevor Voss noticed something was different with her about 2 weeks into it. She wasn't sure what tipped him off. Trevor was attentive in the way that ambitious people in second-tier positions were attentive, not out of warmth, but out of the specific vigilance of a man who kept a careful accounting of everything that might affect his position. He was 41, impeccably dressed, and had an MBA from Wharton that he'd found ways to mention in approximately 40% of conversations. He was good at his job, technically. He was also a man who had never quite forgiven the universe for the fact that he was the CFO and not the CEO, and had arrived at a state of managed resentment that he kept carefully beneath a surface of professional cooperation. He stopped by her office on a Thursday afternoon, which he did often enough that it wasn't notable, except that he closed the door, which he didn't usually do. "Who's the guy?" he said. She looked up from her laptop. "Excuse me? You've left the office before 6 twice this week. You were distracted in the board prep meeting. You declined the Kessler dinner, which you never decline." He sat down in the chair across from her desk with the practiced ease of someone who'd decided to have this conversation. "You're different. I'm noting that you're different." "You're noting it," she repeated. "As someone who cares about this company's public profile, yes." "Trevor," she kept her voice even, "my schedule is my own business. Your public associations are the company's business. You know that. We've talked about that in the context of, this is not a public association." She held his gaze. "It's a private matter." He was quiet for a moment. He was the kind of man who processed in real time, cataloging, filing, deciding. "Brielle, I want to support you, you know that, but optics are my department," she said. "And I've been managing my own optics since before you joined this company. Was there something else?" There was a beat. He smiled. The measured CFO smile that said, of course, and stood. "No, just checking in." She watched him leave. After the door closed, she sat for a moment with the particular low-grade unease of a woman who had built a company and still had to sit in rooms where men made decisions about what was and wasn't her business. The interview happened on a Saturday. Avery had prepared 7 questions, which she produced from a folded piece of notebook paper with the gravity of a congressional subcommittee. She was wearing what she clearly considered her professional outfit, a blue dress with a cardigan, and her braids were pulled back with a clip. She sat across from Brielle at the kitchen table in Nolan's apartment and set a crayon-decorated notebook in front of her, open to a blank page, pencil ready. Nolan had made coffee. He was in the kitchen, nominally doing dishes, actually listening to everything. "Question 1, Avery said. "What did you want to be when you were my age?" "A marine biologist," Brielle said. Avery looked up. "Really?" "I was obsessed with sharks. I had 23 books about sharks. I checked out every shark documentary from the library 4 times. "What happened?" "I discovered computers. Turns out computers are equally interesting and you don't have to get in the water." Avery wrote something in her notebook. From the kitchen, Brielle heard what might have been a quiet laugh. "Question 2, Avery said. "Did anyone tell you that you couldn't do it?" The room was quiet for a moment. "Yes," Brielle said. "Many times. In many different ways." "What did you do?" "I kept going." She paused. "And I was angry. I want to be honest with you. I was really angry sometimes, because anger, when you don't let it eat you, is useful. It's fuel." Avery wrote this down. Then she looked up with the direct, unfiltered gaze she'd inherited from somewhere. "Dad gets angry too," she said, "but he doesn't talk about it." From the kitchen, the dishwater sound stopped. Brielle looked at Avery and chose her words. People who are carrying a lot tend not to talk about what it costs them, because they don't want anyone else to worry. Avery considered this. She wrote something in the notebook and then looked up again. "That's not very fair to the people who want to help."
The sound of dishes resumed.
No, Brielle said quietly. It isn't.
They got through all 7 questions. The last one was, if you could tell your younger self one thing, what would it be? And Brielle sat with it for a moment before she said, I'd tell her that the things people say about you to make themselves feel bigger don't have anything to do with who you actually are, and that she should probably stop waiting for permission to take up space. Avery wrote every word. After the interview, Nolan drove her to the train. She'd taken the train today, on purpose, which was a decision she didn't examine too closely. They sat in his truck at the curb, the engine running, the radio at low volume playing something country that he'd turned down when she got in, and she'd told him he didn't have to turn it down. She's going to put that interview in her presentation, he said. Her teacher is going to think she made you up.
But tell her to use the company website. There's a headshot. He laughed. A real one, which she was beginning to recognize. It was lower than his speaking voice and came without warning. She'll love that. She looked out the windshield at the train station entrance. You should talk to her, she said, about what things cost you. He was quiet. She's perceptive, Brielle said. She already knows you're carrying something. The only thing you're protecting her from is the part where she gets to help. The words sat there. I know, he said finally. I know that. Okay. It's just... He stopped. He had a hand on the steering wheel even though the truck wasn't moving. She's already dealt with enough loss. I don't want her worrying about whether the rent gets paid or whether I'm tired or... She's already worrying, Brielle said. She told me you don't ask for help, and look how tired you are. He looked at her. 8 years old, Brielle said.
He looked back at the windshield. Yeah. She didn't say anything else because she'd said the thing she meant to say, and she wasn't the kind of person who undermined a point by padding it. The train would come in 6 minutes, according to the app on her phone. The soup, she said. Kara's recipe. What's wrong with it? He blinked. The subject shift surprised him. I don't know. It's almost right, but not right. It's missing something, I think, in the spice balance. She never wrote it down exactly, just estimated, and I've been trying to reverse engineer it for 4 years. What kind of soup? Vietnamese tomato and egg. It sounds simple, but send me what you have, Brielle said. The recipe as you have it. I'm decent in a kitchen. He looked at her with an expression she was starting to be able to read, the one where he was trying to figure out if she was being generous or if she meant it, as though the two were mutually exclusive. I mean it, she said. Okay, he said. She got out of the truck. The night air was cold and clean. Through the truck window, she could see him sitting there, not pulling away yet. She walked toward the station entrance and did not look back because she was a woman who had never found looking back particularly useful. But she was aware, in the way you're aware of certain things without seeing them, that his truck stayed at the curb until she was through the door. She went down the steps to the platform. The train came. She got on, and the city moved past the windows in the dark, and she thought about a notebook with crayon decorations and a question about what it feels like when people tell you that you can't, and a man who'd taught himself a whole trade to be present for a child. And she thought about how full a life could be when it was this stripped of pretense, and how long it had been since she'd sat in a room where nobody was performing anything. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she'd saved 2 weeks ago as Nolan/Pierce. It said, she wants to know if you like plants. For a thank you gift. She looked at the message for a moment. Outside the window, the city lights blurred past. She typed back, tell her succulents, low maintenance, we're alike that way. The 3 dots appeared. Then, she says that's the funniest thing she's ever heard, and also she thinks you should come to her school presentation. Brielle read this twice. Then she typed, when is it? The train moved through the dark, and the city moved around it, and somewhere across town, a man was probably standing in his kitchen looking at his phone with an expression she was learning to read, and his daughter was probably already planning a seating arrangement. The dots appeared. 2 weeks. She's already put your name on the guest list. I told her she should have asked first. Brielle looked out at the dark windows. She's right, Brielle typed back. You should have. She set her phone in her lap. She was not a woman who believed in easy things. She had built her life around the understanding that everything that mattered took sustained effort, and that effort was usually uncomfortable, and that comfort was frequently the enemy of progress. She believed this about business, and she believed it about herself. And she had arrived at 39 with a company worth $460 million, and an apartment that was beautiful in a way that was mostly functional, and a social life that was efficient rather than warm. And she had believed for a long time that this was the shape of the life she had. The train moved. She was not sure anymore that she had the shape right. The school presentation was on a Thursday. Brielle blocked 2 hours on her calendar and told her assistant it was a private appointment, which produced a look she chose not to address. She arrived at Avery's elementary school in a car she'd had drop her a block away, because showing up to a third-grade presentation in a company SUV felt like the wrong register. The school was a public school in Avondale, 3 stories of brick with a marquee sign out front and a mural on the east wall that the students had painted, apparently 2 years ago. It showed Chicago's skyline in the colors children chose when they weren't yet concerned about realism, purples and oranges, and a sun that was 4 times the size of the Willis Tower. Nolan was already inside, standing near the back of the classroom with his arms crossed, watching Avery arrange her poster board at the front of the room with the intense focus of a person who had been preparing for a high-stakes event and was now managing pre-event logistics. He was in a clean flannel shirt and dark jeans, which Brielle had come to recognize as his version of dressed up. He saw her when she came through the door, and something in his posture changed. Not much, just a degree of loosening, like a knot that eased without untying. "She's been up since 5, he said quietly when she reached him. "Is she nervous?" "She told me she doesn't get nervous, which means she's terrified." Avery looked up from her poster board, saw Brielle, and performed a wave so controlled it was clear she'd been practicing appearing calm. Brielle raised a hand back with equal composure. "She put your headshot on the poster," Nolan said. Brielle looked. There it was, her official Stellar Path headshot, printed on regular copy paper and affixed to the bottom corner of the board next to a hand-lettered caption, "My interview subject, a real person I actually talked to." "I like the editorial clarification," Brielle said. Her teacher apparently asked if she'd made the whole thing up. The presentation was 12 minutes long, and it was, in Brielle's professional opinion, better than 3 investor pitches she'd sat through in the last 6 months. Avery stood at the front of the room without fidgeting and said, in the clear, deliberate voice of someone who had rehearsed until the words became automatic, "My inventor is Brielle Hawthorne. She didn't invent one thing, she invented a whole system. And the reason that's important is because a system is what holds all the other things together. And without the system, everything breaks." She paused. She looked at her poster board. People told her she couldn't. She was angry. But she said anger is fuel if you don't let it eat you, and she kept going. Brielle stood in the back of the classroom and kept her face neutral with the same discipline she used in boardrooms, which was considerable and was almost enough. After, in the hallway, Avery came running out with the poster under her arm and stopped in front of Brielle and said, "Did I do it right?" "You did it exactly right." "I was nervous." "You didn't show it." "Dad taught me that," Avery said. "He says you can feel whatever you feel, but you don't have to give it the microphone." Brielle looked at Nolan over the top of Avery's head. He was looking at the floor. "That's good advice," Brielle said, "from a smart person." They went for tacos afterward at a place around the corner from the school that had plastic chairs and incredible salsa and served in paper baskets. Avery ate with one hand and held her poster with the other, refusing to let it lean against anything unsupervised. Nolan ordered in Spanish that was better than Brielle had expected, which she mentioned, and he said he'd learned it from a coworker, Manuel, who'd been with Meridian for 11 years and had decided that if Nolan was going to be his partner on jobs, he was going to speak the language, and had taught him with the rigorous intolerance of a man who believed you either committed or you didn't. "Do you still work with him?" Brielle asked. "Most days, he's the one covering my Thursday jobs this afternoon." "He should have come to the presentation," Avery said. "He had 4 jobs. He could have come to just the good part." "The whole thing was the good part," Nolan said. Avery considered this and decided to accept it. She put a chip in her salsa. "Brielle, do you have friends?" "Avery," Nolan said,
I'm asking because she seems like she works a lot, and I'm trying to understand her life. It's okay, Brielle said. She thought about it honestly. I have people I like and trust, but I work a lot, so I don't always protect the time for them the way I should. Dad does that too. He says he's going to call his friend Derek, and then he never calls Derek. I call Derek, Nolan said. When? I called him in February. It's October. Nolan picked up his taco. This is a quality salsa. Brielle smiled into her paper basket. She was aware of what it meant, not just the warmth of the moment, but the particular quality of feeling comfortable enough to smile when you meant it. In a room where nobody needed anything from you, and you weren't being evaluated for anything, and the only agenda on the table was tacos and a school project and a small person conducting aggressive life assessments. She couldn't remember the last time she'd had that. The first story ran on a Monday. It was a gossip column item, small, a paragraph in a Chicago media blog that ran under a headline she saw when her assistant forwarded her the morning press summary. It said, Stellar Path CEO Brielle Hawthorne, recently spotted around town with an unidentified companion, reportedly seen at an Avondale elementary school last week. Sources say the man is a local tradesman. Brielle's rep did not respond to requests for comment. She read it twice. Then she called her PR director, a woman named Sheila, who had been doing crisis communications for 20 years and had developed the steadiness of someone who'd seen everything. I saw it, Sheila said, before Brielle could speak. It's a gossip blog. It is right now. These things have a shelf life of about 48 hours before someone with a larger audience picks it up. There's nothing to pick up. Sheila was quiet in the particular way she was quiet when she disagreed but was choosing her words. Brielle, so you're a public figure with a complicated public profile. Any personal story that involves you gets magnified. You know that. So what are you telling me? I'm telling you to be prepared. And I'm asking you if this person knows what being associated with you publicly might mean for him. Brielle sat with that. She hadn't told Nolan. Not directly. She'd mentioned once in passing that she had press attention sometimes, and he'd nodded with the vague acknowledgement of someone for whom press attention was an abstraction. He wasn't a man who read gossip blogs. He wasn't a man who had a PR director or a morning press summary or a crisis communications protocol. He was a man who had a lunch break and a truck and a Thursday schedule that he'd already rearranged once this week. I hear you, Brielle told Sheila. She put the phone down and stared at her desk for a while. She told him that night. Not in person, he was working the security job until 11, but by text, because waiting felt dishonest. And Brielle, whatever her flaws, was not a person who did dishonest by omission, if she could help it. She typed, There's a small press item about us. Nothing major. A blog item. I wanted you to know before someone else told you. He didn't respond for 2 hours, which was expected because he was working, but the 2 hours felt like a longer unit of time than it actually was. When the response came, it said, What kind of blog item? She sent him the link. 3 minutes passed. Okay, he wrote. Are you okay? She asked. I'm at work. I know. I'm asking anyway. A pause. Then, I'll figure it out. She put her phone down and looked at the ceiling of her apartment, 14 feet high, original plaster molding from 1924, which was one of the reasons she'd bought the place. It was beautiful in the late light. She noticed it less than she should. She was aware, in the particular way she was aware of things she didn't want to be aware of, that she had brought this into his life. That whatever attention now moved in his direction was there because of her, because of the fact of her visibility, her history, the way the world had opinions about who she was and what she looked like, and what it meant when someone stood next to her in public. She had known, somewhere under the part of herself that was busy valuing the tacos and the school presentation and the truck at the curb, that this was coming. She had known, and she had not prepared for it with the rigor she would have applied to a business problem, because preparing for it required admitting that it was going to happen, and admitting that required admitting how much she didn't want it to. Trevor Voss called her into his office, which was a notable inversion, CFO, calling CEO. And they both knew it, on a Wednesday morning, 11 days after the first blog item.
There had been 3 more since, each from a slightly larger outlet, each with slightly more detail, each landing a little harder. One had a photo, she didn't know how they'd gotten it, of her and Nolan walking on a sidewalk, taken from distance, not intimate in any real way, but intimate looking in the way that street photography always flattened context. "Sit down," Trevor said, which was also a notable inversion, and Brielle sat because she wanted to hear where this went. He had printed the photo. He had it on his desk, face up, which told her this conversation had been staged. Trevor Voss staged conversations the way some people staged rooms, deliberately, for effect. "I'm going to be direct," he said. "Please. This is a problem for the company." The company's stock closed up 2 points yesterday. This week, over the quarter, I know what it's doing over the quarter, Trevor. I run the company. He absorbed this with the practiced equanimity of a man who'd spent years managing his reactions. "The board is asking questions. 3 investors have reached out to me directly. Not to you, to me, which tells you something about the temperature of this. It tells me they're going around the CEO to the CFO, which is a conversation I'll be having with each of them individually. Brielle," he leaned forward, "I understand that you have a personal life. I understand you're entitled to one. But this man," he touched the photo with one finger, "he's nobody. Nobody has any idea who he is or what he wants. And when that's the case, the story writes itself." She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to tell me what the story is?" "The story is that you're a wealthy single woman and he's a man who came from nowhere, and the natural conclusion that people draw is that he's after my money. It is what people are saying." "What people, specifically?" He picked up his phone and showed her. A comment thread under the 3rd blog item. Anonymous accounts, most of them, with the specific cruelty of people who operated without faces. Gold digger. She's obviously paying him. Wonder how much the janitor is charging per hour. And worse things, directed at her, the kind of things that people felt entitled to say about women's bodies in the comment sections of the internet. She looked at it for the time it took to absorb it, and then she looked up. "Close that," she said. He closed his phone. "I want to be very clear with you," she said, in the tone she used when she was being very clear. "My personal life is not a company liability. My relationship with this person is not subject to a risk assessment. And if any investor has questions about my judgment, they can book time directly with me. And if they apply pressure, they can apply it to my face. That's what my face is for." He studied her. She held his look without working at it. "I'm trying to protect the company," he said. "I know," she said. "So am I. We just disagree about the threat." She stood up and left his office and walked back to her own and sat at her desk for 7 minutes, not working, which was unusual for her. She sat and thought about Trevor's face when he'd touched the photo, and the particular quality of that gesture. Proprietary, certain, the gesture of a man who'd decided something and was in the process of implementing it. Then she opened her laptop and sent a message to her head of internal security, a woman named Dana, who had come from federal law enforcement and had no patience for anything she considered theater. The message said, "I need a quiet review of CFO activity, internal communications, expense accounts, anything unusual in the last 18 months. Treat it as routine compliance. Don't flag it to him." She pressed send. Then she went back to work. It got worse before Brielle had the chance to make it better. The story that broke on a Friday, not a blog item now, a genuine news outlet, a Chicago-based digital publication with 200,000 readers, had Nolan's full name, his employer, his neighborhood, and a quote from an unnamed source that said, in print, "People close to the situation have raised concerns that Pierce may be cultivating the relationship for financial benefit. Hawthorne's associates are said to be alarmed by the speed of the attachment." She read it at 6:45 in the morning and called Sheila immediately. "I saw it," Sheila said. "Who's the source?" "I don't know yet. I'm working on it." "I want to know." "I know you do." She called Nolan at 7. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant he'd already seen it. "Hey," he said. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm genuinely sorry. It's not your fault.
It's associated with me. That makes it Brielle. His voice was even, but she'd learned to hear what was underneath his evenness, and underneath it there was something strained and exhausted that he was managing. Can I call you back? I need to drop Avery at school first. Of course. She doesn't know yet. I want to talk to her before she hears something. The call ended. She stood in her kitchen in her apartment, 14-foot ceilings, 1924 plaster molding, a kitchen with more counter space than she ever used, and she thought about what it meant to have to explain to an 8-year-old why people were saying things about her father in the newspaper. He called back 40 minutes later. How did she take it? Brielle asked. He was quiet for a beat. She said, Did you do something wrong? And I said no. And she said, Then why do they think you did? And I said, Because sometimes people see a situation and fill in the parts they don't know with something that makes sense to them, even if it's wrong. Another pause. And she said, That's dumb. And I said, Yes, it is. Brielle sat down on her kitchen stool. She's right. I know. Nolan, do you want to? She stopped. This was the part she'd been circling for 3 weeks, the question she hadn't asked because asking it changed things irrevocably. Do you want to step back from this? From me, until it passes. The silence that followed was long enough that she started to answer it in her own mind before he spoke. Is that what you want? He said. I'm asking what you want. I know what I want, he said. I'm asking about you because you're the one losing something here. I'm a guy with a toolbox and a security badge, and nobody cares what I think about the stock market. But you have a company. You have a board. You have investors who are apparently calling your CFO. I can handle my investors. I believe you, but you shouldn't have to handle them because of me. The conversation sat there. She pressed her palm flat on the cool kitchen counter and looked at her hand. Bare, no rings, the faint callus on the side of her right index finger from the way she held a pen. She was a woman who had made hard decisions in rooms full of people who didn't want her to, and she had never once let those people define her direction. I'm not stepping back, she said. He didn't say anything. I want to be clear, she said, not because you asked me to stay, but because I'm making my own decision. I don't run from things that matter because they get difficult. I never have. Another long quiet. Okay, he said. Okay. What neither of them knew, what Brielle would only begin to learn 3 days later, when Dana sent her a preliminary report with a subject line that said, not routine, was that the source for the article was not a journalist who dug up a lead. The quote from an unnamed associate. The specific phrasing about speed of attachment and financial concern. These were not things that had leaked organically from the frictions of a public life. They had been placed. Dana's report was 12 pages. Brielle read it in her office with the door closed on a Monday evening after everyone else had left. She read it once quickly and then went back to the beginning and read it again slowly. And by the end of the second read, her face was completely still, with the particular stillness of a person who has just understood the full shape of something. Trevor Voss had been running a parallel operation, not dramatic in any individual piece, but systematic and aggregate. Messages to 2 journalists, neither flagged in the company's disclosure system. A dinner, expensed as a client meeting, with a man whose name appeared once in a court filing from 4 years ago related to a defamation case. Internal emails carefully worded to 2 board members, framing concern about Brielle's judgment in language that was plausibly professional. And there was more. The compliance detail buried in page 8, in Dana's dry, federal-trained prose that stripped emotion from everything it described. 17 months of irregular expense approvals, vendor payments that didn't match contracted rates, a consulting agreement with a shell entity that had no public record of existence. Trevor Voss wasn't just trying to damage Nolan's reputation. He was trying to remove Brielle from her own company. She closed the report. She looked at the window. The Chicago skyline at night was very beautiful from the 38th floor. She had looked at it 1,000 times without really looking at it, and she looked at it now. She thought about what Avery had said. That's dumb. Yes, she thought, it was. She picked up her phone and called Dana. I've read it, she said. I thought you might want to sit with it overnight before. I don't need to sit with it. Her voice was even and focused in the way that happened when she was past emotion and into problem solving. I need you to keep pulling. Everything. Go back as far as the records go. I want the whole picture.
It'll take another week. You have 5 days. Dana did not argue. One of the things Brielle valued most about her. And Dana, Brielle said, nobody knows this is happening. Not Sheila, not the board, nobody except you and me. Understood. She ended the call. Then she called Nolan. It was 9:15. He picked up on the third ring with the slightly confused alertness of someone who'd been almost asleep. Sorry, she said. I know it's late. It's fine. What's wrong? Nothing. She paused. Nothing. I wanted to hear a normal voice. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the different register he sometimes had at the end of the day, when the management of everything had come down a notch. You okay? She looked at the skyline. I will be, she said. And she meant it, not as comfort, not as performance, as a specific operational intention, the way she meant every commitment she made, with the full understanding that meaning something and making it happen were the same gesture, in her experience, when you were the kind of person who did not stop. She sat with the phone against her ear and the city spread out below her and thought about a man asleep in a truck at a curb, waiting until she was through a door. She thought about a girl with a notebook and 7 questions and a poster with a headshot on it. She thought about a necklace in a box in a closet, kept safe for someone who wasn't ready for it yet. She thought about what it meant to protect the things that mattered when the machinery of other people's ambition came for them. Then she said goodnight, and she closed the files on her desk, and she started building the case. Dana's final report landed on a Thursday morning, 5 days after Brielle had asked for it, exactly on schedule. It was 23 pages. Brielle read it at her kitchen table before 6 a.m. in the particular quiet of early morning that she'd always found useful for hard things. No calls, no emails demanding immediate response, just coffee and light and information that required clear eyes. By the time she finished the last page, the coffee was cold and the light had shifted from gray to the specific pale yellow of a Chicago autumn morning, and she had the complete picture. 18 months. That was how long Trevor Voss had been building toward this. Not dramatically, not all at once. That wasn't how men like Trevor operated. Men like Trevor were architects before they were anything else. They laid foundations. They worked in increments. They understood that a single large betrayal was visible and traceable, but 100 small ones distributed across time and personnel and financial vehicles could look like noise until someone sat down and drew lines between the points. Dana had drawn the lines. The embezzlement was the cleanest piece of it. $214,000 moved through a consulting agreement with an entity called Voss Advisory Partners LLC, incorporated 11 months ago in Delaware. Sole member listed as a family trust that traced back through 2 holding companies to Trevor's wife. The invoices were detailed enough to be plausible and vague enough to be unverifiable, which was exactly the balance of someone who'd done this before or had very good advice about how to do it. The campaign against Nolan was layered on top of it. Brielle could see the logic now. Trevor hadn't started targeting Nolan because of any genuine concern about the company. He'd started targeting Nolan because Nolan was the most available lever. If Brielle was distracted, embattled, publicly defensive, she'd be weaker at the board level. A CEO managing a personal scandal was a CEO with diminished capital. And a diminished Brielle was a Voss opportunity. She closed the report and sat very still for a moment. Then she called Richard Colt. He picked up on the 4th ring, voice thick with sleep. Brielle, it's 6 in the morning. I know. I'm sorry to call this early. I need 30 minutes with you before the summit. A pause. She could hear him sitting up. What happened? I'll tell you in person. Can you be at my office at 8? Yes. He didn't ask more questions. This was one of the many things she valued about Richard Colt. When she said something was serious, he believed her. Thank you, she said, and ended the call. The Stellar Path Annual Shareholders Summit had been scheduled for 6 weeks. It was held every year in November at a downtown hotel, the Meridian Grand, which had nothing to do with Nolan's employer except for the coincidence of the name, which Brielle had noticed and found grimly amusing. 300 attendees, institutional investors, board members, industry press, a collection of the company's top clients, and a clutch of analysts whose job was to decide what everything meant and then tell other people about it. Trevor had been preparing to use it as a stage. Brielle knew this now with clarity. The agenda item labeled Leadership Alignment and Strategic Direction in the Summit Program, a 40-minute block scheduled for the afternoon session, was not, as it had been framed, a routine strategic overview. It was the culmination. The moment Trevor had been building toward for 18 months, dressed in the language of fiduciary responsibility, timed for maximum institutional audience. Brielle had been in enough rooms to know how these things went. You arrived with documentation. You had the right people aligned in advance. You framed the concern in terms of duty rather than ambition, and then you let the room's inertia do the rest. Trevor was good at rooms. He was genuinely good at rooms. She had known this for years and had considered it an asset. She met with Richard at 8 in her office, with the door closed and the report printed and Dana present because Dana's credibility was federal and clean, and Richard would want to ask questions about methodology. Richard read slowly. He was the kind of reader who used his finger on the page, which meant you could see where he was in the document by watching his hand, and Brielle watched him move through page 8 and page 9 and the consulting agreement detail, and watched his jaw change. He looked up at her when he finished. "How long have you known?" he said. "Dana began the review 3 weeks ago. I've had the full picture since this morning." "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I needed the complete picture before I moved. A partial case is a warning. A complete case is a resolution." He looked at Dana, who nodded once with the economy of someone who'd testified before a lot of people and had learned that words were most powerful in small quantities. "What do you need?" Richard said. "2 board members in this room at noon, the ones he hasn't contacted, and I need your word that nothing moves externally until I'm ready." "You have it." He put the report on her desk. "And Brielle? What about today? The summit is in 6 hours." "I know," she said. "We're going to let it run." Richard looked at her. "I want him to walk into that room thinking he's going to win," she said, "because the alternative is he lawyers up over the weekend and we spend 3 months in depositions when we could close this today in front of the audience he chose." Richard was quiet for a moment. He'd been doing business for 40 years, and he had the quality of very experienced people. He knew when someone had thought something through and when they were improvising. He was reading her now and finding the former. "All right," he said. "Hot." She called Nolan at 10. He was on a job in Lincoln Park, a routine inspection that he'd managed to not cancel despite the week he'd had. She could hear the ambient noise of a building, the hollow echo of a mechanical room, something running in the background. "I can't really talk right now," he said. "I know. I'll be fast." She was standing at her office window, the city below her, the Summit Hotel visible from where she stood, a gray tower 12 blocks south. "There are some things happening today that might make the news. I wanted you to hear it from me first." A pause. The background noise of the job. "What kind of things?" "The source of the press campaign against you. I know who it was. It's being addressed today, publicly." Silence. "Nolan, I heard you." His voice was careful. "What does publicly mean?" "It means the shareholders' summit. It means a room of 300 people and industry press and a story that's going to correct the record on what was said about you." Another silence, longer. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." "Brielle, you were targeted because of your association with me," she said. "That's on me to fix. I'm fixing it." He was quiet for a moment in a way she'd learned to read. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say, but the quiet of someone who had too much and was deciding what to let through. "Are you going to be okay?" he said. "Today. Is this going to cost you something?" She thought about the report on her desk. She thought about 18 months of deliberate, careful betrayal. She thought about the thing Trevor hadn't understood, that the same quality that made her build a company from $40,000 was the same quality that made her, in this specific moment, completely unafraid of him. "Not the way he planned," she said. "So, The Meridian Grand's main ballroom held 340 people comfortably, and it was full. Brielle had been to many rooms like this, big rooms that smelled of fresh linens and the specific nervous energy of people whose professional comfort depended on the right outcome, and she had learned to move through them without advertising what she was thinking. She worked the room before the program started the way she always worked rooms, deliberately, making contact with the people she needed to make contact with, brief and warm, and leaving each conversation before it became comfortable enough to extend. Trevor was already there when she arrived, working his own section of the room with the ease of someone who believed the day was already decided. He saw her from across the ballroom and nodded, the measured, collegial nod of a man who'd made peace with the action he was about to take, the way you made peace with something you'd been planning for a long time. She nodded back. The program ran its first 2 hours without event. The keynote, the product update, the client panels, all of it proceeded with the professional smoothness of an event managed by people who were good at events. Brielle delivered her opening address from the stage with the composure of a woman who had prepared extensively and watched the room respond to her the way it always did, respectfully, attentively, with the particular quality of attention that people gave to someone who had built something real. Trevor sat in the front row and smiled. The afternoon session began at 2. The leadership alignment and strategic direction block was scheduled for 2:40. At 2:15, Brielle went backstage and found her AV team and gave them a drive. At 2:30, she found Richard near the stage entrance. He looked at her with the expression of a man who had been thinking about this for 6 hours and had arrived at a kind of calm. "Ready?" he said. "Yes." "The 2 board members are positioned." "Good." "The legal team is in the side room." "I know." He looked at her for a moment. "He doesn't know you have any of this." "No." "How are you so sure?" "Because if he knew, he would have moved already. He's a man who moves when he's cornered, and he doesn't know he's cornered yet." Richard nodded. "Richard." She looked at him directly. "Thank you. For 40 seconds this morning, when I told you, before you asked a single question, you just said yes. I want you to know I noticed that." He looked briefly away, which was the Richard Colt equivalent of being moved. "Go close this out," he said. Trevor took the stage at 2:40 with the particular energy of a man who had been preparing for his best moment. He was dressed impeccably, as always. He opened with numbers, Q3 data, market position, competitive landscape, and he was genuinely good at this part. The room listened, the numbers were real, and he presented them cleanly. Then he arrived at the section. "I want to address something directly," he said, in the tone of a man choosing courage over comfort. "As an executive team, we have a responsibility to this company's stakeholders to be transparent about factors that may affect strategic stability. Over the past several months, there have been concerns about leadership focus, about external associations that carry reputational implications. I want to open a frank conversation about how we ensure Stellar Path's trajectory remains. Trevor." Her voice came from the back of the room, and it carried, not because she raised it, but because of the specific quality of her voice when she was completely certain of something, a quality that filled space without effort. Every head turned. Brielle Hawthorne walked from the back of the ballroom to the stage with the unhurried step of a woman who had never needed to rush toward something she already controlled. She was in a deep blue suit she'd worn 3 times before. Not because it was her most impressive, but because she was comfortable in it, and comfort was functional, and today was an operational day. She stepped onto the stage. Trevor looked at her with an expression that recalibrated, fraction by fraction, from confident to uncertain to the very beginnings of something that wasn't quite fear, but was in its neighborhood. "I'll take it from here," she said to him, simply. And then she turned to the room. She stood at the podium for a moment without speaking. The room was absolutely still. 300 people in the specific silence of a crowd that understood something had shifted and didn't yet know what. "I want to talk to you about this company," she said. "What it's built on, what I believe it stands for, and some things that have been happening that you deserve to know." She nodded to the AV desk. The screens on either side of the stage, large, clean, visible from every corner of the ballroom, came to life. Not a presentation slide, a document. Dana's report, selected pages, The key figures and the consulting agreement and the vendor discrepancy tables, clean and legible at scale. The room shifted. 18 months ago, Brielle said, a systematic embezzlement operation began within this company's financial infrastructure. $214,000 moved through a fictitious consulting arrangement to an entity controlled by a member of our executive team. She paused. The documentation on these screens represents the findings of a compliance review conducted over the past 3 weeks. It is complete, verified, and has already been provided to legal counsel and to the appropriate board members. The room was the quietest she'd ever heard a room of 300 people be. She looked at Trevor. He had gone very still. The stillness of a man whose architecture had just been displayed to everyone in the room simultaneously, every beam and load-bearing wall exposed. Additionally, Brielle said, turning back to the audience, I want to address something else. Something that is not a financial matter, but a human one. She took a breath. Not for composure, she had that, but for the small space that the next part required. Some of you have read about my personal life in the press over the last several weeks, specifically about a man I've been spending time with, and the narrative that was built around that, a narrative of manipulation, of opportunism, of a woman with poor judgment being taken advantage of. The room was with her now. She could feel it. That narrative was not organic. It was constructed by the same person who constructed the financial arrangement you're looking at on these screens. The press contacts, the sourcing of stories, the strategic timing. It's all in the documentation. She paused. Why? Because a distracted CEO is a vulnerable CEO, and a vulnerable CEO is an opportunity. She let that land. The man at the center of that story is named Nolan Pierce. He's a heating and air conditioning technician. He works 2 jobs. He's raising his 8-year-old daughter alone since losing his wife 5 years ago. He met me at a restaurant on a rainy Friday evening when another man publicly humiliated me in front of 50 people and walked out, and Nolan was the only person in that room who stood up. She stopped. He invited me to join him and his daughter for dinner. That was it. That was the entire basis of the story that was used to try to destabilize this company and my position in it. She heard something from the audience. Not a sound exactly, but a quality of listening that was different from before. The kind of listening people do when they are reconsidering something. I want to say something about that evening at the restaurant, she said. Not because it's anyone's business, but because it's relevant to what I believe this company stands for and what I believe we owe each other as people. She looked out at the audience. I have been a public figure for long enough to know what rooms do when I walk into them. I've built a $460 million company in an industry that did not make space for me and did not expect me to last and has been waiting for a long time for me to prove it right. I know what it costs to walk into a room and be evaluated on things that have nothing to do with your ability or your work or your character. And I know what it means, what it actually means, when someone looks at you like a person instead of a headline. She was quiet for a moment. That's what Nolan Pierce did. On a rainy Friday in October, at a restaurant in downtown Chicago, a man who makes $48,000 a year and drives a truck with a dent in the passenger door and reads to his daughter every night even though she's old enough to read herself. That man stood up when nobody else did, and he asked me if I wanted to join them for dinner. She looked out at the room. He didn't know who I was. He didn't check. He just saw a person who'd been treated badly and did the straightforward human thing. The room was completely still. I've spent 39 years being told, in various ways, that I needed to earn my place. In boardrooms and investor meetings and restaurants and comment sections and blind dates arranged by people who meant well. Her voice was level, measured. I'm done earning it. This is my company. I built it. And the values I built it on, precision, integrity, the basic dignity of treating people like they matter. Those values did not come from a brand strategy. They came from knowing what it feels like when they're absent. She turned back to Trevor Voss, who had not moved. Trevor, she said simply and without drama, you're going to want to step off the stage. He looked at her. The room looked at him. There was nowhere to go that wasn't visible. He stepped off the stage. At the side door, 2 members of the building's security team were waiting, along with a man in a suit from the legal team who had a folder in his hand and the specific expression of someone delivering paperwork. Trevor said something to the legal man that the room couldn't hear, and the legal man responded with a single sentence, and Trevor's face did something complicated and then went blank. The room watched him leave. Then the room looked back at Brielle. She stood at the podium in her blue suit and she looked out at 300 people, investors and board members and journalists and clients and analysts. And she let the silence breathe for a moment before she said, in a different register, quieter and more direct, "I'd like to continue with the program, if that's all right with everyone. We have a product roadmap presentation in 30 minutes that I'm genuinely excited about, and I don't want to give this situation more of your afternoon than it's earned." But there was a beat. And then Richard Colt, 64 years old, married for 37 years, organizer of blind dates that ended badly, and also, apparently, the kind of man who knew when to start something. Richard Colt stood up. He began to applaud. The room followed. It wasn't immediate. Rooms never moved all at once. They moved in sections, like a wave. The people in the front first, and then spreading back. And it was not the polished, choreographed ovation of a room that had agreed in advance to respond this way. It was the real kind, which was louder and less synchronized and included at least 2 people in the third row who were clearly surprised to find themselves on their feet. Brielle stood at the podium and let it happen. She did not cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't at a restaurant on a rainy Friday in October, and she kept promises she made to herself. But she looked out at the standing room and thought, for just a moment, about an 8-year-old girl with a gap in her front teeth asking 7 questions from a notebook with crayon decorations, and about a man in a flannel shirt who had stood up in a restaurant because he thought it was the straightforward human thing to do. She thought about what it meant, what it actually, practically meant, to have someone stand up. She tapped the microphone once. "Thank you," she said. "Let's get back to work." She called Nolan at 4:15 from a small room off the main ballroom while the product roadmap presentation was running and the room's energy had shifted into the cleaner register of people who were interested in what was being said. He picked up immediately this time. "I saw the live stream," he said. Before she could speak, "Someone at Meridian had it on his phone in the break room. Manuel called me over and I saw it." She leaned against the wall of the small room. "How much of it?" "Most of part 2, from the restaurant story on." She waited. "You said my truck has a dent in the passenger door," he said. "It does. To 300 people. And the live stream." He was quiet. She heard him breathing. Then he said, in the particular voice he had when something had hit him, and he was deciding whether to let her know, "Brielle, yeah. That thing you said about him standing up at the restaurant. Yes. You didn't have to say it like that. I know. You made it sound like—" He stopped, started again. "I just did what anyone would do." "I know you believe that," she said. "That's the whole point." He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she wondered if the call had dropped. Then he said, quietly and without preamble, "Avery's violin lesson is on Saturdays now. Manuel's wife knows someone who teaches in Bridgeport. It's $20 a lesson." She waited. "I figured you should know," he said, "what our week looks like, since apparently people know what my truck looks like." She laughed. It surprised her again, the quality of it, the way it came out real. "I'll keep that in mind," she said. "Good." Outside the small room, she could hear the hum of the ballroom, the presentation, the room's attention, the ordinary, productive noise of 300 people doing what they'd come to do. The afternoon had turned into something she hadn't fully planned for in the hours before it. She had planned the case. She had planned the room. She had not entirely planned the part where she stood at a podium in front of everyone she knew professionally and said, out loud, in public, that a man with a dented truck had seen her clearly on a night when nobody else did. But she had meant every word. She put her phone in her pocket and went back to the ballroom. Trevor Voss was terminated for cause on a Monday, 11 days after the summit. The legal process had moved with the particular efficiency of a company that had documentation in good order and a board that was unified and a CEO who had been building cases her entire professional life and understood that the difference between justice and noise was preparation. Trevor's attorneys made 2 attempts at negotiation. The first was a counter-narrative about executive discretion and strategic disagreement. The second was quieter and involved a number that Brielle declined without discussion. The embezzlement finding went to prosecutors on a Wednesday. By Thursday, it was filed. By Friday, it was public. The press coverage was significant, not because corporate fraud was unusual. It wasn't, but because the story had context now, the kind of context that made it legible to people who didn't normally read financial crime reporting. The Summit livestream had already circulated. The moment Brielle had named Nolan from the podium, had described a restaurant and a rainy Friday, and a man who stood up when nobody else did, that footage had moved through the internet the way things moved when they touched something real in people, which was fast and wide and without a lot of editorial direction. The comment sections, which had spent several weeks being ugly, reversed themselves with the particular speed of a crowd that had been handed a new narrative and found it more satisfying than the old one. This was not, Brielle knew, a vindication of public opinion. Public opinion was not a moral instrument. It was a weather system. It moved according to conditions, not conscience, and it could shift again. She had no illusions about that. But Nolan's name was different now in the public record. The man who had been described as a gold digger by anonymous sources in a blog item was now being described, in a Chicago Tribune piece that ran on a Saturday, as an example of something the writer called quiet integrity, a phrase Nolan, when she read it to him over the phone, received with the silence of someone who found being described in newspapers deeply unnatural. Quiet integrity, he repeated. That's what they said. I fixed a boiler this morning. I know. The Tribune doesn't usually care about boilers. They care now. She paused. How are you handling it? Honestly. A beat. She could hear him in his kitchen, the sound of something on the stove, which probably meant it was dinner time and he was doing 3 things at once. It's weird, he said. People at the building yesterday. One of the tenants recognized me. She asked for a photo. I didn't know what to do with that. What did you do? I said sure, and then I stood there like an idiot while she figured out how to work her phone. Brielle smiled. You're handling it fine. Avery thinks it's hilarious. She told her whole class her dad was famous, and her teacher had to explain the difference between famous and briefly newsworthy. Her teacher is wrong. You're famous. Don't say that. Briefly, she conceded. He laughed, low and real, and she heard the stove click off. Dinner's ready, he said. You want to come over? She looked at her apartment, the 14-foot ceilings, the beautiful kitchen she used mainly for coffee, the city out the window in the early dark of November. Yes, she said. Mom, she took the train. She had started doing that, taking the train to Avondale, not out of any deliberate symbolism, but because she'd done it once and found she liked it. She liked the ordinariness of it. She liked sitting in a car with people who were going home from work and didn't know who she was, reading their phones or their books, or staring at the middle distance with the particular expression of people processing their days. She was a woman who had spent a long time moving through the city in cars with tinted windows, and there was something about the train that reminded her that the city was full and ordinary and ongoing, that most of it had nothing to do with her, and that this was a good thing. Nolan's apartment was on the second floor of a 3-flat with a blue door that she'd been to enough times now to know the particular stiffness of the front latch and the way the 3rd step on the stairs creaked. The apartment itself was small and impeccably organized in the way of someone who didn't have extra space and had learned to treat space as a resource. The living room had bookshelves on 2 walls, his reading, which ran to history and practical reference, and Avery's, which was organized by size and color in a system that Avery had devised and maintained with visible pride. There was a couch that was old but clean. There were framed photos on the wall by the kitchen. Avery at various ages, a photo of the Bridgeport neighborhood that looked like it had been taken in the 1980s, and one photo of Kara, brown-haired, laughing at something outside the frame, caught in the middle of a gesture, alive in the way that candid photos caught people alive. Brielle had looked at that photo many times. She thought Kara looked like someone who laughed easily and meant it. Avery was at the kitchen table doing homework when Brielle arrived, and she looked up and said hi. with the casual warmth of someone for whom this visitor had become a normal thing, which was the highest possible form of welcome. Then she returned to her worksheet, which appeared to be long division, and which she was approaching with the particular expression of a person engaged in combat. "How's the division?" Brielle said, sitting down across from her. "It's fine," Avery said, in the tone of someone for whom it was not fine. "You want help?" "Dad says I have to try for 10 minutes first. Reasonable rule." "It's been 9 minutes," Avery said, looking at the clock. Brielle looked at Nolan, who was plating food at the counter with his back to them and his shoulders doing something that was very close to shaking. "1 more minute," Brielle said. Avery stared at the worksheet. The minute passed with dramatic slowness. Then, "Okay, now can you help?" They worked through 4 problems before dinner, Brielle explaining the scaffolding of the process with the same directness she used for everything. Not simplified, not condescending, just clear. Avery was a fast learner when the logic was visible to her, and by the 3rd problem she was getting there on her own and narrating her steps aloud with growing confidence. "I think I actually get it now," she said, with genuine surprise. "You did get it. You did the work. You explained it better than my teacher. Your teacher has 25 students. I have 1. Avery considered this. "That's a better ratio." "It is," Brielle agreed. Nolan put food on the table and they ate the way they'd been eating for 2 months now, with the low-grade comfortable noise of people who had gotten used to each other's presence. He'd made the chicken stir-fry, which Brielle had eaten 3 times and had come to understand was his reliable workhorse, the thing he made when he didn't have time to think about what to make. It was good. Not refined, not complex, just good. Properly seasoned, vegetables with texture, rice that had been cooked correctly. He was a better cook than he believed he was, which was something she'd said once and he'd dismissed, and she'd stopped saying because it was more effective to just eat the food with evident appreciation and let that speak. "Avery," Nolan said halfway through dinner, "did you tell Brielle about Ms. Kaminsky?" Avery made a face. "Who's Ms. Kaminsky?" Brielle said. "My violin teacher." Avery poked at her rice. "She says I have natural talent." "That's good." "She says I need to practice more." "Also good." "She says..." Avery sighed deeply. "She says I rush the slow parts because I get bored." Brielle looked at Nolan. "Don't," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You had a look." "I have a neutral face." "You had a look that said she gets it from somewhere." Avery looked between them with the focused attention of a child who was aware that something amusing was happening above her head and was working to bring it into view. "Do you rush the slow parts?" Avery asked Brielle. Brielle picked up her fork. "Constantly," she said. "My entire life. It's a work in progress." "Miss Kaminsky says the slow parts are where the music actually lives." "Miss Kaminsky sounds smart." "She's 100 years old and she smells like peppermint," Avery said, with the frank cruelty of children describing the elderly. "But she plays really beautifully, like actually beautifully. I want to play like that someday." "Then practice the slow parts," Brielle said. Avery considered this. "Yeah," she said. "Okay." After dinner, after Avery had been sent to do the second half of her homework, and the dishes had been done in the particular negotiation of 2 people working in a small kitchen, Brielle washing, Nolan drying, both of them making the small adjustments that people made when they'd learned each other's rhythms. They sat on the couch with what was left of a bottle of wine Brielle had brought, and the low evening quiet of an apartment where a child was doing homework in the next room, and the city was outside doing what cities did. "The foundation application," Nolan said. He'd been holding something back all evening. She could tell by the slight tension in how he'd been carrying himself, the thing underneath the normalcy of dinner. "I want to talk about it." She turned to look at him. 3 weeks earlier, she had told him about an initiative she was building, a foundation funded through a significant portion of Stellar Path's charitable trust, structured to provide practical support for children of single parents and for people who'd experienced public humiliation campaigns, legal resources, counseling, financial stabilization grants. It had been in her head since the summit, since the moment she'd stood at the podium and said what she'd said, and felt the room shift, and had understood that the shift wasn't enough on its own. A shift in a room lasted a day. A structure lasted longer. She'd asked him if he'd consider running the program's Chicago pilot. Director-level position, real salary, the kind that would cover violin lessons and unpaid bills and allow him to stop doing security work 3 nights a week. Work that matched what he'd actually been doing all along, finding practical solutions to impossible logistics, navigating systems that weren't designed to be navigated, doing the quiet work that kept things functional. He had asked for 2 weeks to think about it. The 2 weeks were up. "I want to do it," he said. She waited. "But I need to say something first." He turned the wine glass in his hand, a habit she'd noticed, the way he handled things when he was thinking through the phrasing of something. "I need to know that this is a job, not—" He stopped. "I need it to be something I earned by being the right person for it, not something that exists because of—" He gestured between them. "Because of what this is." She held his look. "The qualifications I put in the job description," she said carefully, were experience navigating complex bureaucratic and financial systems with limited resources, demonstrated ability to build trust with people in crisis, practical problem solving under pressure, and a specific kind of patience that cannot be taught in a classroom." She paused. "Do those qualifications describe you?" He was quiet. "They were written for you," she said. "But they are real qualifications, and you meet every one of them genuinely. If you were a stranger who applied, I would hire you." She kept her eyes on him. "You're not a charity case, Nolan. You're the right person. I need you to be able to hold both of those things." He looked at his glass. "I'm not good at accepting things," he said finally. The words came out with the difficulty of something true that had been sitting a long time. "I know. It's not pride, exactly. It's more like—" He stopped. Started again. "When Kara died, I had to figure everything out alone. And somewhere in figuring it out alone, I started treating aloneness like proof of something. Like if I could manage without help, then the situation was manageable. And if I needed help, then—" He shook his head. "Then I'd failed somehow." She didn't say anything. She'd learned that when he arrived at something real, the thing to do was give it room. "Avery told me something last week," he said. "She said, 'Dad, Miss Kaminsky says the best musicians know when to listen to someone who plays better than them.' And she looked at me in that way she has." He laughed once, brief. "The way Kara used to look at me. Like she could see exactly what I was doing and had decided to let me figure it out, but was going to make sure I knew she'd noticed." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Finish your dinner.' Effective. I've been thinking about it since." He set the glass down on the coffee table and turned to look at her fully. The direct look, the one that didn't flinch. "I spent a long time being the person who stands up because it's the right thing to do, and then walks away before anyone can do anything about it. You saw that first night. I stood up and then I sat back down, and then I just offered you dinner because I didn't know what else to do." He paused. "I'm not good at being on the receiving end of things." "I know," she said. "I'm not either." He looked at her. "I have spent," she said carefully, 39 years making sure I never needed anything from anyone. Because needing things gave people leverage, and leverage was how they hurt you. I have a company worth nearly $500 million, and until 2 months ago, I genuinely could not tell you the last time I sat in a room where I wasn't calculating whether I was safe." She stopped. "You changed that. You and your 8-year-old in a restaurant on a Friday without trying to. And it terrified me for weeks because it was something I hadn't planned for. And I don't do well with things I haven't planned for." He was very still. "So," she said, "we're both bad at this. We're both better at giving than receiving. We both have walls built from losses we didn't choose. We're both figuring this out in real time without a clear map. I think that's actually the only honest basis for anything." The apartment was quiet. From the back room, the sound of Avery's pencil scratching on paper, and somewhere outside the city, traffic, wind, the faint rumble of the train a few blocks over. "Okay," Nolan said. "Okay? I'll take the job." He looked at her. "And I'm saying yes to this, all of it, whatever this is." She looked back at him. Yeah, she said. Me too. It was not a romantic moment in the way movies made romantic moments. Nobody scored it. Nobody lit it particularly well. They were two tired people on an old couch with wine and leftover dishes in the drying rack and a child doing math homework in the next room, and the moment was real in the way that only unscripted things were real. Slightly imperfect, slightly nervous, completely true. He reached out and took her hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way you take the hand of someone whose hand you want to hold, and left it at that. She looked down at their hands. Then she looked up, and they sat there in the quiet, and did not need to make it anything other than what it was. The Stellar Path Foundation for Family Stability launched its Chicago pilot in February, 4 months after the shareholders' summit. The launch event was not at the Meridian Grand. Brielle had chosen a community center in Bridgeport, Nolan's childhood neighborhood on the south side, which had a gymnasium that held 200 people and smelled like floor wax and old bleacher wood, and the particular institutional cleanness of a building that had been maintained by people who took their work seriously. It was nothing like the summit. The chairs were folding, the coffee was from a 40-cup percolator in the corner and tasted exactly like that. The PA system required 2 attempts to get working, during which Nolan stood at the microphone and waited with the complete patience of a man who had spent his professional life waiting for systems to cooperate. When it finally worked, he said, "Good afternoon. My name is Nolan Pierce. I'm the program director for the Stellar Path Foundation, and I want to tell you what we're actually here to do without a lot of language that makes simple things sound complicated." He talked for 14 minutes. He talked about what the program provided: emergency financial grants, legal navigation support, counseling resources, and a job placement network specifically designed for single parents re-entering the workforce or transitioning between careers. He talked about the eligibility criteria in plain terms. He talked about how to apply and how long it took and what happened next. He talked the way he talked, directly, without performing, looking at specific people in the audience instead of over their heads. Brielle stood near the back of the gymnasium and watched the room watch him. She had been in a lot of rooms. She had seen a lot of speakers. She had developed, over years, an instinct for the difference between someone who was good at presenting information and someone who had actual authority, not the authority of a title or a platform, but the authority that came from people being able to tell, just by watching, that the person in front of them knew something real. Nolan had that. He'd had it at a restaurant on a Friday in October, and he had it here in a gymnasium in Bridgeport in February, and it had nothing to do with the suit he was wearing, which was new, which he'd mentioned approximately once with the neutral tone of someone still getting used to having work clothes that weren't work clothes, and everything to do with the way he stood up and told the truth. Avery was in the 3rd row, next to Manuel and Manuel's wife, Rosa, who had brought a container of food that was sitting under her chair and who had cried briefly and without apology at something Nolan said in the first 5 minutes. Avery was watching her father with the expression she'd worn at her own school presentation. Concentrated, proud, working to appear less proud than she was. After, in the parking lot, while the room was still going, people talking to program staff, filling out interest forms, Rosa pressing food into the hands of the community center director with the insistence of someone who expressed care through feeding, Manuel found Brielle near the door. He was a compact man in his early 50s, with a weathered face and the quality of someone who said only what he meant. He'd worked with Nolan for 6 years. He was the person Nolan had learned Spanish from, imperfectly and with effort, which was the only way Nolan learned anything. "He's going to be good at this," Manuel said, without preamble. "I know," Brielle said. "He worries he won't be." "I know that too." Manuel nodded, once, the way he seemed to nod at things that confirmed what he already believed. "He's been different, this year." He looked out at the parking lot. "After Kara, he did okay. He kept things going, but there was something that went very quiet in him. You know what I mean?" She did. "It's less quiet now," Manuel said. He looked at her with the frank assessment of someone who had no interest in social varnish. "Whatever you did, it's less quiet." She looked back at him. "He did it," she said. "I just showed up." Manuel considered this. "That's usually what it takes," he said, and went back inside to get some of Rosa's food before it was gone. Avery's first real violin recital was in March. It was a small thing. 8 students, a church fellowship hall, parents with phones ready, Ms. Kaminsky in a chair to the side with the expression of someone who had seen many recitals and maintained expectations accordingly. Avery played a simplified arrangement of something classical that Brielle didn't immediately recognize, and she played it with the focused intensity of someone who had been told by Ms. Kaminsky to slow down on the slow parts, and had taken this instruction seriously to the point that she sometimes overcompensated and went slower than necessary, which Ms. Kaminsky had also told her, and which she was in the process of balancing. It was not a flawless performance. There was a moment in the second section where she lost her place and recovered it, and her face during the recovery showed everything. The brief flash of panic, the finding of the thread, the deliberate steadying, the return. Brielle watched Nolan watch his daughter work through that moment and saw his jaw do something subtle and controlled, the way parents' jaws did when their children were going through something hard in public and they couldn't help. Avery finished. She lowered the bow. She looked at Ms. Kaminsky, then at the audience, then specifically at her father. He was already on his feet. The other parents joined him, the way people joined standing ovations when the first person made it safe to stand, and the fellowship hall filled with the sound of 8 families applauding their children. Afterward, in the parking lot, Avery held her violin case with both hands and submitted to 3 photos from Nolan with the patience of someone who understood this was required, and then she found Brielle and said, without ceremony, "I messed up in the middle." "I know," Brielle said. "You fixed it." Ms. Kaminsky says recovery is as important as playing it right the first time. Ms. Kaminsky is correct. Avery thought about this. "Did you see Dad stand up first?" "I did." "He always does that." She said it simply, as a statement of fact about her father's character, the kind of observation children made when they'd been watching someone long enough to know what they always did. "Even at school things, even when I mess something up, he always stands up first." Brielle looked across the parking lot at Nolan, who was talking to one of the other parents, laughing at something. The real laugh, the low one that came without announcement. "Yeah," she said. "He does." The night Nolan brought her back to Ardent was in October, a full year after the first time. The reservation was under Pierce, party of 3, and the maitre d', Gerald, still there, same posture, found it immediately, without the pause. He recognized them. That was visible. What was also visible was that he recognized them differently than he might have a year ago, not with the wariness of someone managing a potentially difficult situation, but with the particular quality of a person encountering something they'd witnessed and had thoughts about. "Welcome back," Gerald said. And he meant it. The restaurant was full, as it had been the first time. Friday night, November, rain on Michigan Avenue. Brielle noticed the rain first, before anything else, before the tables or the lighting or the familiar smell of beeswax candles. The rain on the windows was the same rain. The city through the glass was the same city, doing what it had been doing. Avery was 9 now. She had grown a specific increment that Brielle could see in how she moved. More length in her limbs, a slight shift in her proportions. The beginning edge of the person she would eventually be visible just underneath the person she was now. She still had the braids and the gap in her front teeth, and the quality of concentrated attention she brought to things that interested her, which was most things. She looked around the restaurant with the frank curiosity of a person encountering a significant location. "This is where it happened," she said. "Yes," Nolan said. "This table was your table?" She was looking at the table to the right of where they were being seated. The same table, still there, still placed at the same angle. "That one," Nolan said. Avery looked at it for a moment, then she looked at Brielle. "Were you scared?" "No," Brielle said. Then, more honestly, "Yes. A different kind of scared. Not of him. Of what it meant that nobody in a room full of people was going to do anything." Avery looked around at the room. The same guests as 1,000 Friday nights, couples, work dinners, a birthday celebration in the back corner. People who had probably never thought about what it cost to walk into this room as the particular person Brielle was. "They're looking at you now," Avery observed. They were. Not the way they'd looked a year ago. Brielle Hawthorne was more recognizable now than she'd been then, not less a subject of the room's attention, but a different kind. The attention had a different quality to it, not the low, sideways appraisal of people finding reasons, something more direct, something closer to the attention you gave to someone whose story you knew and had considered.
Yes, Brielle said. They are. Does it bother you? Less than it used to. Avery accepted this and opened the menu.
Dinner was what dinner had become for them over a year of Thursday evenings and Saturday errands, and 100 small occasions that had accumulated without announcement into a life that contained all three of them in it. Avery ordered the pasta and negotiated unsuccessfully for a Shirley Temple, and settled for sparkling water with the resigned dignity of someone who'd made the attempt. Nolan ordered steak because it was a special occasion, which he mentioned once and didn't belabor. Brielle ordered the duck confit, which was still excellent, which she'd known it would be. They talked about Avery's school, a project on ecosystems that she was finding interesting, a conflict with a classmate named Devin that she was finding less interesting and more exhausting, a field trip coming up that she was primarily excited about because of the bus ride, because Avery had always liked the in-between of going somewhere as much as the arriving. They talked about the foundation. The pilot program had reached 43 families in its first 3 months, and the waitlist suggested demand for a broader rollout, which Nolan had been building the case for and which Brielle was already planning. They talked about Manuel and Rosa's new kitchen renovation, which Manuel was doing himself and had described to Nolan in great and admiring detail, and which Rosa was managing with the patience of a woman who understood that some battles were not worth engaging. It was ordinary, genuinely, specifically ordinary, which was not a small thing. Ordinary was what you earned after enough unusual. After dessert, Avery got the lava cake, which she'd gotten the first time and which remained a perfect choice. Nolan said he needed a few minutes and would be right back, and excused himself toward the back of the restaurant. Avery, with the studied casualness of someone who had been briefed, became very interested in the remains of her lava cake. Brielle watched him go. Then she looked at Avery, who was not looking at her, and said, "You know something." Avery took a bite of cake. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Avery Grace Pierce. That's my name." "What does your father have planned?" Avery took another bite and looked at the ceiling with an expression of profound innocence that was, given her face, not very convincing. "You practice that," Brielle said. "Possibly." "How long have you known?" "He asked me—" Avery stopped, reconsidered. "He told me—" She stopped again. "I'm not supposed to say anything." "You already said something." "I said possibly. That's not the same as saying something." Brielle looked at this child. This 9-year-old who had walked into her office with a handmade drawing and 7 questions in a notebook, who played the violin with her whole self and got impatient with the slow parts, who asked questions that adults avoided and said things that were more accurate than most people twice her age managed. This child who had lost her mother at 3 and had found ways to carry that loss and also to be completely, fully, unguardedly herself despite it, who had told her father he looked tired and asked Brielle if she liked plants and stood up in a 3rd-grade classroom and said that a system was what held everything together. "Avery," Brielle said. "Yeah." "You know the drawing you made, the one you brought to my office." Avery looked at her. The practiced innocence dropped and something more real came through, the child's version of the same directness her father had. 3 people holding hands, Brielle said. "Yeah." "Is that still what you want?" Avery was quiet for a moment. The restaurant moved around them. The ambient noise of other people's evenings, the familiar percussion of a full room. "I've wanted that since the first night," Avery said. "When you ordered the lava cake." She picked up her spoon. "I figured anyone who ordered the lava cake without even being asked was probably a keeper." Brielle looked at this child for a moment. Then she said, "That is both the most and least romantic reason I've ever heard." "I'm 9, Avery said. "I don't do romance. I do logic." Nolan came back to the table. He sat down across from Brielle. He looked at Avery, who had returned to her studied innocence with renewed commitment, and then he looked at Brielle, and she saw in his face the particular quality of a man who had rehearsed something and was now recalibrating in real time because the moment was different from the practice version, the way moments always were. She decided to make it easier. "Nolan," she said, Yeah. Whatever you're about to do, shout. You don't have to perform it. You can just say it. He exhaled. The performance dropped, and what remained was just him, tired around the eyes as always, honest in the face as always, carrying what he carried in the particular upright way he carried it. He reached into his jacket pocket. The box was small. Not a jewelry store box, not a velvet square. A plain matte box, dark blue, the kind that could have come from anywhere. He set it on the table between them and left it there. I'm not good at speeches, he said. You know that. I know. I made one, actually. I wrote it down. He looked briefly pained. It was terrible. Avery read it and said it sounded like a corporate email. It did, Avery confirmed. So I'm not going to give the speech. He looked at Brielle across the table. I'm just going to tell you the actual thing, which is that the year before I met you, I was doing okay. I was managing. I was keeping everything going. And then I saw someone being treated badly in a room full of people who were going to let it happen, and I stood up, and that was just a thing you do. That was just the obvious thing. He paused. I didn't know it was going to change everything. I didn't know you were going to be the kind of person who took the train to Avondale on a Tuesday evening and told me I should talk to my daughter and ordered a lava cake for a kid you'd met 20 minutes ago and sat in my kitchen and helped with long division and showed up. He stopped. I didn't know that doing the obvious thing was going to lead to any of this. The restaurant was quiet around their table. Not silent. It was a full room. It was never silent, but the particular radius of quiet that formed around moments that were real. I'm not a romantic person, Nolan said. I'm a person who fixes things and gets up early and doesn't call Derek enough and makes a soup that's still not quite right after 4 years. I have a truck with a dent in the passenger door. I live in a second-floor apartment, and I cannot believe 300 people know that. He looked at her. But I know how to show up. I know how to stay. And I know that whatever I was doing before you, just managing, just keeping things going, I don't want to go back to that. I don't want to manage. I want this. I want the train rides and the lava cake and the long division, and I want you specifically. Not an idea of you. You. He opened the box. The ring was not elaborate. A single stone, clean, set in a simple band. The kind of ring chosen by someone who understood that the point was the weight of what it meant and not the performance of the thing itself. Around them, the restaurant continued. Other tables, other evenings, the ongoing ordinary life of a full room. And then, slowly, the way it had happened the first time, but with a different quality entirely, the room went quiet. People at nearby tables had noticed. Gerald, from near the host station, had noticed. The couple at the table by the window, the same window that looked out onto the wet gleam of Michigan Avenue, had turned to look. Brielle, Nolan said, I'm asking you to marry me. Avery is already planning the seating arrangement, so your answer affects about 30 logistical decisions she's already made, but yes, she said. She said it before he finished the sentence, which was not something she'd planned. It came out with the same quality her best decisions had. Not impulsive, but certain, the way you were certain of things you'd been moving toward without knowing it. The recognition of something that had already been true for a while before you found the word for it. His face did something she'd never seen it do before. Not the almost smile, not the low laugh. Something that was neither of those things and both of them. Something unguarded and complete. He took the ring out of the box and she put out her hand and he put it on her finger, and it fit, which probably meant Avery had been involved in the sizing, and she looked at Avery, who was attempting a face of surprise and failing completely. You measured my ring, Brielle said. I borrowed one of yours, Avery said. The silver one in the dish by your sink, just for 5 minutes. How long ago did you borrow it? 3 weeks. You've known for 3 weeks. It was very hard, Avery said, with genuine sincerity. Around them, the room had understood what it had witnessed, and it did the thing that rooms did in those moments. It gave them what the moment deserved. Not the polished ovation of an event, not the coordinated response of an audience that had been cued. Just people putting down their forks and glasses and phones and clapping because a person who had walked into this room a year ago and been made to feel like she didn't belong in it had just, in this same room, been asked by a man who'd stood up for her to spend her life with him. Gerald began it, from the host station, with the discreet but genuine applause of a man who had seen every kind of evening this restaurant offered and recognized this one as something different. The table by the window joined, the birthday table in the back. Brielle sat with the ring on her finger and the noise of the room around her, and Avery beaming with the uncomplicated joy of someone who'd done a thing, and it had worked. And she looked at Nolan, who was looking at her with the direct, unflinching look she'd known since the first night. And she thought about all the rooms she'd walked through in her life, calculating whether she was safe. She thought about what it felt like to be in a room and not need to calculate. She thought about a woman who'd built something from nothing and kept going through every room that told her to stop, and had arrived, finally, not at success. She'd had that for years, and it had been colder than she'd expected. But at this, a ring that fit, a child who'd borrowed the sizing ring 3 weeks ago and kept the secret until she couldn't, a man who had written a speech and thrown it away and just said the true thing instead. She thought about a rainy Friday and a question asked without performance. Would you like to join us for dinner? She had spent a long time believing that the measure of a life was what you built. The square footage, the revenue, the column inches, the cover stories. These things were real. She had worked for every one of them, and she did not apologize for them, and they would continue to matter. But sitting in this restaurant, with the ring new on her finger and the room still going around them, and Avery eating the last of her lava cake with the satisfied expression of a mission accomplished, she understood something she hadn't had language for before. The measure was not what you built. The measure was what you stood up for. A man she loved had stood up in this room when it cost him nothing. And nobody was watching, and there was no particular reason to, except that it was the right thing. And he was the kind of person who did the right thing when it was obvious. That was it. That was the whole origin of this evening, of this ring, of this life that had reorganized itself around a question asked over a breadbasket on a Friday in October. You stood up. And then things became possible that hadn't been possible before. She picked up her water glass. Avery, she said. Yeah. The seating chart. How many people? Avery produced a folded piece of paper from somewhere, Brielle genuinely did not know from where she had been watching, and unfolded it on the table. Currently 41, Avery said, smoothing the paper. But Manuel says Rosa will be upset if we don't invite her sister, so probably 43. Nolan put his face in his hands. Brielle laughed, the real kind, the one that came without warning, and reached across the table and pulled the seating chart toward her to look at it. Outside, the rain continued on Michigan Avenue, the same rain it had always been. The city went on doing what cities did. In a restaurant with beeswax candles and a maitre d' named Gerald and a window that looked out onto the wet gleam of the street, 3 people sat around a table with a seating chart and a ring and a lava cake plate that was being scraped with the dedication it deserved. The door that had once closed behind a man walking out had become the door they would walk out together. Not as a symbol, not as a statement, just as 3 people who had found each other in the ordinary chaos of a city on a rainy night and had chosen every day since to show up. That was the whole story. That was enough.